Casual Magic has been sponsored by Quiver, maker of the Quiver and Bolt deck cases and other fine deck holding accessories. Use the code CASUAL on their website for 10% off your order. We're also sponsored by Architect, the premier site for hosting your decks on the internet. I love them and they love me, and it seems like a good reason for you to use them. You can also support Casual Magic directly by going to our Patreon at patreon.com/ShivamB. And now, on with the show. Hello and welcome to Casual Magic, the show where we talk about the fun side of Magic the Gathering. My name is Shivam, Bhatt, and Casual Magic is brought to you by Quiver and Architect and my patrons at patreon.com/ShivamB. Today I'm very excited to have one of my dear friends, a complete firecracker and eternal savant, and just like, I don't know, super fun person to talk to all the time. My dear friend Sahar Mirhadi, who is back again for the second time. If you want to hear the first time around where you can actually learn her backstory and whatever, it's in October of 2022, episode 143 of this show, which is cool because it's all on YouTube now. So like anybody can go back and actually look at my show. Do you know this is episode 249 of my show?
That's terrifying.
That's a lot.
That's so many episodes. That's so many people you've spoken to.
I have missed 1 week since I started.
That's amazing. That
is the most consistent I've done anything short of like have a real job and be married in my life.
That's incredible.
Yeah,
I'm so impressed. I was impressed that me and my co-host are doing one video a week. Barely doing that. It's just incredible. I mean, I'll talk about that later, but
yeah. It's one of those things where you're like, you don't realize your growth in like, you know, your mental health and your ability to work until you look back and you're like, oh, I have done a lot and come a very long distance since I started.
Hell yeah.
And it's just, it's a really good feeling to be like, wow, I'm sticking. I said I was going to do a thing and by crumb, I've stuck with it.
By gummins, I'm going to do it whether I like it or not. We're here now.
Yeah, exactly. So, Sahara, I had you back on because of the fact that, among other things, you're also a PhD candidate and student, and I don't know what they call them, a scholar of some nonsense.
Doctoral researcher.
That's the word.
Yeah.
Have you gotten your degree yet, or is this still on the process thereof?
I'm about to embark on my final year of 4. So it's taken so long.
Oh God.
But it's exciting because I have just done the final bits for my first piece of academic work to be published.
Nice.
When this comes out, I will probably be in Finland presenting my research, which
sick.
is honestly incredible. I cannot wait.
Oh, you're going to be in a room full of nerds who are going to be listening attentively while you point to charts on screen.
Some charts. I don't have as many charts. More tables. I got more tables than charts.
Okay, I can see the difference between tables and charts. Okay,
yeah. I got more tables because a lot of my stuff is very qualitatively focused. So it's like, look at these tables where I'd ask the people and they tell me the thing and all that kind of stuff.
Fair.
But also, I saw you at Magicon Amsterdam, which was honestly incredible.
We got to hang out in Amsterdam. Yeah. Meeting you in person was so delightful just because like we've been friends for a very long time. Yeah. I think that's my favorite part of Magicon is just being able to be like, look, this is a person I talk to daily who I have literally never met before. Yeah. But I mean, we're old. We know the internet. You know, you have friends who you've known for like 25 whatever years that you've seen like never or at a conference or something. And like, I love that. I think that's amazing.
Meeting you and meeting Wheeler were like my highlights of the weekend. Because
you had a panel too, man. Come on.
I did have a panel. The panel was also genuinely incredible. So that's on YouTube. I had the joy of having Emma Partlow, Andreas Peterson, and Daniel Kane wax lyrical.
Yeah, Daniel. See, that's the thing. I knew that there were panels there, and I was going to go to them because literally I was staying at Danny's house. And yet, I got so Magic-conned that I didn't even remember that Danny had 2 panels, and one of them was with you, and it was like, until like Sunday evening, I was like, oh, balls, I was going to go to all these panels, and I totally just didn't.
That happens. But it's all on YouTube.
Is there a way to crank your gain down a smidge?
Oh, I can probably mostly just move
or
me
just
away.
Push your mic back a little.
I'll push my mic back.
Yeah, that's right. Go ahead. But yeah, it's all on YouTube, I know.
It was great. I honestly had the best time, and it was so heartwarming hearing people's accounts, hearing not only the competitive side, but also the casual side and how the two can kind of come together. And yeah, it was lovely. And I genuinely was it was so much love in the room.
I did the first Magicon mental health panel that Hobbs did back in Vegas.
Yes.
And I found it to be a particularly traumatic experience that I was not expecting, because I was on a panel with some people who got real heavy and real dark real quick. And then I was like, oh, this is deeply uncomfortable for me, and I'm not sure I want to do this again. But I recognize the validity of it and how important it is for us to be able to share these stories, especially with because we're in a community where people don't necessarily talk about themselves or their problems, just about the results they're getting or about the cards or about the game. And we don't realize the sacrifices sometimes, or the risks that we take on ourselves sometimes to be better at competitiveness, or to just Magic solves a lot of problems, but it does not solve a lot of problems.
Oh, you're telling me. I'm studying video games, and I notice it with Magic as well. I feel like for us, our panel didn't go too deep in terms of lived experience accounts, but we definitely had people who asked about, hey, I'm trying to move up, I'm trying to understand, how I navigate it. I think having someone like Andreas, who has sort of done the Levine trench of being very competitive, being in the quagmire, and then coming out of it the other side going, I just love Magic and I like playing at the highest level and playing at my best, was a really nice insight. And we definitely asked questions about a bunch of other stuff, which I think is really good. But yeah, go check out on YouTube. It's incredible. Yeah. And yes, I am also an academic researcher, looking at how video games can support coping during times of difficulty, which is where Magic came into it.
Yeah. And also the fact it's very convenient to have happened right after the global lockdown, where guess what? All we had was Animal Crossing.
I was that Animal Crossing generation. Although between you and me, Shivam, if so as part of my academic life, I have a reference manager where I dump a bunch of papers that I will say I will read and then never read. I have a section of categories called COVID content, which is all the papers that came out during COVID about how COVID helped. And it's growing daily, because obviously the academic cycle takes anywhere from a year to 2 years to publish. So I was like, there are still people talking about how COVID helped. I'm like, okay, yes, sure. One of the reasons why I did my PhD is because I was the Animal Crossing generation. I was in the middle of doing my master's in positive psychology, which the irony is not lost on me, of me trying to understand the study of well-being in the middle of a global pandemic. Honestly, I had to practice a lot of well-being. It was, again, irony not lost. But I saw how video games, I was initially interested in technology, but then I looked at how video games were helping people, and I wanted to understand why, and what is it about the medium that's different to, say, books or TV or film.
I mean, the obviously I'm not a scholar, however I've got 20 years of experience being in the games industry or whatever.
Correct.
And as a person who's dealt with being on the press side and seeing how consumer response works, and how people having done so many interviews with gamers over the decades, of just in terms of what does this mean for you, represent for you, how do you work out things, or even my own behaviors when I'm really, really angry or upset. I will either go and grab something like a Dynasty Warriors where I can just cleave through a million peasants and not think about it, or Civilization, where I'm just in a zen state, I'm not thinking about anything, and I'm just moving one step at a time, one tile at a time, until my background process works itself out.
Exactly.
For instance, there are just times where I'm like, look, I need to go and I need to play Vampire Saviors, or Survivors, or I need to play whatever it is, and just allow myself this decompression moment.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there are times when I've seen in my own in my own journalistic research, not scholarly research, but that there are times when people will this is obviously a classic example, but taking an MMO and be like, yo, my life sucks so much that I'm going to escape into this product and live in this world because it is better than the one that I'm physically
Oh,
in.
oh,
And
Shivam, you're about to just quote my entire research to the wider world. You said the E word. You said escapism.
oh well, I mean, isn't that that's the heart of it all, right? Like,
Yeah, yes
if
and
I'm
no.
playing Baldur's Gate, I'm just a gigantic Superman who looks awesome, and nobody is being racist against, and everybody loved me, and people of all genders want to like sleep with my character,
Yeah,
of course. And then I come out, and I'm a dweeby nerd in real life. Why would I want to be here when I can be the God King there?
it's well, that's sort of way. That's why I kind of went into it in terms of coping,
Mm,
as like an interest, because like I could have done escapism. The challenge with looking at escapism is when people say it in the kind of video game kind of cadence, and it's like, that word has a lot of significance when you
yeah,
talk to gamers, but when you
connotation.
exactly, that's the word I was going to thank you. But then trying to break down academically within the research what escapism actually means is an absolute minefield, because the
Yeah.
player motivation literature will say one thing. Some people say it's a form of coping. Some people say it's a distraction. Some people will say it's full on disengagement. Some people say it's like withdrawal.
Hmm.
Some people say it's a link to gaming disorder. Some people, and before you know it, it unravels so quickly. Whereas I felt with coping, yes, it's fairly monolithic in its sort of like background.
Mm.
It's from like, I'm not going to go too much into like the academic drivel, but like it's, there are coping strategies that have been studied for the last 50 years. And you can kind of look at them and see, okay, these seem to link here. But
Mm.
where I was sort of interested in is how can games, rather than just a player experience of games help me to cope. We've seen
Mm.
that with Animal Crossing. We've seen anecdotal accounts. This has helped me cope with dealing this kind of what you're saying about just having that time to decompress,
Yeah.
have that temporary respite. That all that stuff is there. But what we don't necessarily know is actually, well, what is it about the games themselves? This was like the thing I was interested in. Is like we know a lot about the experience and why people
Mm.
play and how, but we don't necessarily know the how. We don't know what it is about the games themselves that makes they do that.
Mm.
And so for me, my first piece of like exploratory work, which I'm going to be talking about, is how can we identify these game aspects that maybe help people or hinder people, because they parts of gaming is both good and bad for players during this particular time. And I
Mm.
chose times of difficulty because I didn't want to just do decompression after work, which is just like recovery. So like you've had a stressful day at work, you just need to decompress.
Mm.
And I didn't want to do sort of the clinical stuff, like psychosis or anything like that, because
Mm.
I mean, that's a clinical nightmare.
That's a different issue entirely.
That's a whole different thing. And there are people doing good research in both sides of this fence.
Sure.
But I felt like with COVID, I saw that there was this like destabilizing period that, but there are other destabilizing periods, people going through grief, mental health challenges, divorce, redundancy,
I've
these are
seen,
still.
like, yeah, no, you're right. Keep going. Keep going.
No, that's, I wanted to
Yeah.
look at it on a broader scope in that respect.
Yeah. Cause like one thing I've seen is, and I think I even wrote an article on this once for like a one up or something like that
Yeah.
years and years ago about people who were like, using video games as a way to mitigate their addiction.
Yeah.
To like other things. For instance, like
Yeah.
someone was like, yo, you know what? I used to be a hardcore like drinker, and now instead of drinking, I play Candy Crush whenever I feel the urge or like I feel the urge to smoke. Instead of smoking, I will grab like a mobile game or something else and use it for that kind of sensory, like just moment in time that
Yeah.
I need to be able to break this habit of physically reaching for a cigarette. I can physically reach for my phone and fiddle faddle, whatever. But it's like, I mean, and to an extent, yes, that's a really great way to mitigate a medical addiction that's bad. But sometimes I worry that you're trading one for another,
Yeah.
and you're not
That's
actually. You're like, yeah, you're solving. I mean, you're not going to get the lung cancer part, but at least you're not solving the underlying issue of this addictive quality, right?
yes. And that's something that one of the issues I've seen a lot with the press talking about video games and well-being as a whole. You might have seen a couple of years ago there was a paper that was published about how games could support well-being, and they looked at Animal Crossing and they looked at Neighborville, and they could see there was a small significant increase. I know the people who did that research. They have subsequently replicated that and seen nothing, which I find amazing, because that also shows that at an aggregate level, when you take all the telemetry data, you look at it at like a policy high level aggregate, that it's not necessarily the well-being predictors aren't necessarily there. For me, I wanted to look at it more from a qualitative perspective and kind of look at the more the player experience side of it, because I feel there's still things that we can find out and sort of begin to understand. So for me, I sort of took the coping strategies, took the game aspects, and the thing that I ended up finding was that different game aspects seem to support different forms of coping. So you could actually identify, again, at an exploratory level, but my rest
Can
of
we
research,
actually stop and do a couple of definitions before we go
of course
further?
you can.
Like, what do you mean by coping?
So oh God, where do you want me to begin? I'll start my thesis chapter. But coping is, hold on, I'm actually just going to find the bit I wrote about coping. It's just, there you go. Just easier to do. So when people experience stressful situations, there's a variety of strategies that they can engage in. And the sort of formal definition is constantly changing cognitive and behavioral efforts to manage specific external or internal demands that are appraised as taxing or exceeding the resources of a person. That's the official from Lazarus and Folkman from like the 1970s. So this idea of you find strategies that can help you in different ways. Now, there are typically the ones that people may know about are like problem-focused coping, which is you deal with the stressor head-on. So social media, for example, if someone has got an issue they're dealing with, they'll use the technology to find the solution. Bish bash bosh, it's done. Emotion-focused coping is more about regulating their emotional response and reducing the distress of the situation. So this is where things are like, if you're dealing with sort of, say, redundancy, and you're like, well, I don't want to start looking for a job, I want to try and like look after myself, self-care, things like that. Avoidance kind of says on the tin, so disengaging from the situation. Meaning focused coping, this is sort of more recent. This is more kind of, I would say recent, it's still like the 90s. But meaning focused coping, kind of deriving some understanding or reframing the situation that you're in. So kind of a more sort of personal growth approach. And then social coping is where you would seek the community of others, or find a community, or feel like you belong to something. So these are different strategies. There's a bunch of others, but those are the five that I kind of typically look at.
Sure.
And I kind of took those strategies and then defined them to how games actually could support those. And then when I went through my research, I found I think I found like 30 odd game aspects, from things like, in-game chat to progression trees to, God, I mean, the list goes on. Simulation of real world activities, the narrative story, complex themes, character development, NPC interactions,
like, for instance, to give like a concrete idea, this is something that I did with my son, who was having trouble at school with, he's like, hey, I can't get this problem, or I keep having trouble in the math and I'm just failing at it, I'm never going to be good at it, whatever. And I'm like, well, wait a second, kid. We sat and we just beat Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. And when you started, you were garbage at it and you couldn't beat a moblin. But now you can walk through the game in 2 hours or something, because of practice and repetition. And
exactly.
So I ended up helping him use the game as a tool to be able to, solve the problems in reality, of like, give you coping strategy, give you understanding of like, hey, if I'm pissed off, instead of going and yelling at this guy, maybe I could just refocus and take it out on an NPC that is not going to be unhappy about it.
That's basically it. And a lot of people said that.
When I get really mad at Magic, I grab Chandelar and then I go and ruin some goddamn computer goblin's life, because, like, guess what? I can play like 3 Contract from Belows and Time Twisters with Underground Dreams, or like Underworld Dreams or whatever, and just like not feel bad that I've just stacks locked this dude into oblivion.
I love it. I love it. But yeah, so for me, like those game aspects, I then, I basically found that like different coping strategies linked to different game aspects. So like the main ones I sort of talk about are sort of emotion focus coping and things around challenge. So this feeling of competence. So like self-determination theory gets thrown about a lot. And I am like, that is a very cool theory, but it's also the one that always get bandied about in games literature. This idea of like the narrative and like meaning focus coping, or when you're talking about escaping into like Civ or like Baldur's Gate 3. So avoidance, something I'm quite passionate about, is the idea of like healthy escapism. People were talking about how they were escaping into, say, Skyrim. People love Skyrim still. Going into Skyrim, going into Legend of Zelda, wherever, other these open world games, and going, you know what? I am disengaging, but it is a positive experience to me. And this is where this idea of escapism comes into it. And this idea of like, I called it positive avoidance in my actual research. Kind of how can you disengage? How can you actually disengage in a healthy way and not get sucked in, like you said, the person who gets sucked into MMOs and lives out their life virtually, and have this element where, and this is kind of how I feel about escapism in video games, is that it is not in out. It is a permeable kind of space that between the virtual and the reality, and you can do both. Because if it's just you're escaping, and it's kind of the phraseology, and this is something that sort of weirdly gets talked about in the literature, is like, are you escaping to something, or are you escaping from something? And this is something that when I was doing my literature review, I nearly wanted to throw this literature out the window and go yeet, because that is that to most people doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're trying to like break that down and try to understand what that actually means and how does that link into sort of wider,
I mean, I get
player experience.
But on like on a surface level, it totally makes sense. Like the idea of like escaping from something. I am in an abusive situation at home, or I am in a bad life scenario. I'm stuck without a dead end, or with a dead end job, whatever. I'm escaping into D&D or into an MMO or into something where I can feel powerful and good, and just not have to worry about, or like process these emotions in a way that doesn't force me to confront them directly. Versus I am escaping into something because it's just better and cooler, and like there's nothing in the real world that is like, and I've seen this in situations outside of just video game stuff where people will go and like, I've seen people basically get like kind of crazy when they go to like a pilgrimage site in India or like Bethlehem or something, and they'll be like, I'm just going to live here in the presence of God and escape into this reality I've constructed for myself, as opposed to the real world where whatever is going on.
I mean, going to Magicon is sort of
well, yeah, but I mean, you know what though? That's the thing. Like every time I come back from Magicon or a GP or a Command Fest or whatever, I make sure to tell people, I'm like, look, we're going to have what I call the return to Sansad, which is we have gone into the Valhalla. We have been in the place where all of the people there speak our language, know what we want, are here for the same reason, where I can speak in my true dialect and not worry about jargon or anything. I can just say, yo, I just him that jerk, and you totally know what I'm talking about, and it's great. And like, you've got this whole like vibration of I am in a place where people know me, understand me, and are here with me. And then you leave that and you return to the real world, and the come down is rough.
It is.
Because you don't understand. Because a lot of people don't have that coping mechanism. Like for me, for years, I would go to these. So my guru, my religious teacher, he does these 9-day long sermons that we go to different places in the world and we sit and listen to Gatha, which is basically the stories of gods, and more. It's like church for like a whole year in a week. But
I love
you're in like a full religious like zone with people of your community. You're with people of your family, your friends, or whatever. Everybody's in this vibration together. We're all having this spiritual experience. And it's there, you're closed off from the rest of reality because you're just in this mode. And when you come back from this mode, you have that hard crash back into, I have to worry about my mortgage and my taxes and my job and my whatever. And like, I've noticed with like Magicon, like I've had this experience for years. So I've learned how to ratchet it down to be able to come back. People coming home from Magicon and go like, oh man, I'm sad. I wish that was forever. I hate that I'm never going to see it. Everything sucks and is miserable. I'm like, no, dude. You're just going through it, and the only way is to like. That's why when I leave a con, or I know it's like the last day, I will take slow steps. I will go and say goodbye to people mindfully. I will go and kind of just give myself a farewell to this building so that I can mentally prepare myself to walk back into the real world. And there's a lot of kids who are growing up today playing games and stuff who are going into like Skyrims and WoWs and what have you, and then don't know how to ratchet back.
Disengage.
Yeah. And I think that's like
challenging
problem we're gonna deal with, right?
Yeah, and I think this is something that I sort of touched on in my the wider stuff I spoke about. And I think that it's interesting that we can see some of this pan out. Again, I fully admit, in terms of my qualitative work, it was very high level exploratory. 20 pages of pure gold. I wrote so much because there was a lot to unpack. There was so much. I was there going like, okay, well, here's the game aspects. I remember when I was doing like the peer review process, because folks, I have to do peer review process.
Which and this somebody had to read all 300 pages you wrote and be like,
Exactly. And I remember one comment very distinctly going, hey, maybe you should just focus on like the coping strategies part. Like, how do they link to coping strategy? I'm like, yeah, but I need to find out the game aspects so that I can relate them to the coping strategy. I had to do all this legwork first before I get to this point. But it was honestly, what we ended up finding was super interesting. The grinding and rewards was one of the things that came out as like as part of challenge. And this idea, it kind of supports some of the literature of this idea of like FOMO and like, do when you play video games that have these like passes or you have to grind to like get stuff, and it's like there's an element of like being motivated to do that, so you feel like you're accomplishing something, you feel competent, things like that. But there's also the fear of missing out and not doing it, which then makes you feel like I have to, and then I have this obligation to do it. So when is it motivating versus obligating? And with Magic, that also comes out. It's like, I see grinders. I'm like, guys, do you want to go to an RCQ?
Right.
Like, do you really want to go to an RCQ? And for me, it's interesting. I remember speaking to, it might have been Jeffrey Palmer or someone, and it's interesting as a researcher now looking at Magic and looking at it in this sort of, me as a player researcher, it's such a weird space. Actually, small world, there is only about, as I'm aware, I think 3 other, myself included, games and games researchers that also play Magic. Myself, there's a guy called Dominic Potts who does stuff on VR and emotion in games. And then there's a guy called Timo Bertram, who I'll shout out, who does a lot of stuff on machine learning with regards to Magic. So in terms of like, how do you make draft sims better and how do you make like the simulating of the draft experience better, which is super cool. I am not that techie, but he informs me that his model is way better than the draft sim model, which honestly, I'll take it.
Yeah, but how are they ever going to model the person who's like, yo, I just like this one because it's got a really pretty rabbit on it, so I'm going to take this?
Well, that's the thing that they say. Like they have, it's hard to simulate that.
It's hard to model terrible drafters.
Exactly. It's hilarious because the AI is better than you. But it's interesting. So yeah, and then there are other, PhD students who are doing stuff, but in games, there's like 3 of us that I found. There's a couple of like artificial intelligence people, but not in games. So I'm like, this very tiny hole of researchers, and we all look at each other and we're like, I can't remember, it might have been Dom actually. Last year I was at RC Ghent and Dom was in the middle of write-up and I was like, Dom, why are you here? He's like, shh. don't stop. I'm like, but Dom, you're meant to be, shh. It's fine, Sahar. As like, and as someone who's about to like start like that process in the next like few months, I am like, you know what? I can start grinding.
Maybe I could just go to Vegas. It'll be fine.
Maybe I just go. Well, that's kind of one of the other things we're going to talk about is
this research.
Exactly. Go have a retreat. But for me, like I'm excited to actually talk about my research. Now what I'm doing moving forward is I kind of want to kind of deconstruct a lot of this and have a deeper understanding. So rather than just looking at the player experience, I'm still looking at that in terms of how players can cope. I'm now trying to see, is there differences in different types of video games that maybe influence the coping strategy and the experience? So I've taken 3 different games. So I'm looking at Disco Elysium, Darkest Dungeon, and Stardew Valley. Very different in the way that they play, and seeing if their player experiences, how do they use it to cope? What role does specific parts of the game help them to cope?
Okay, I can see Stardew Valley. Stardew Valley is a safety farm sim. Of course, it's very easy to lose yourself in that.
Yeah.
Disco Elysium, you're like, oh, look at all these lovely, beautiful queer gods and super. Disco Elysium's a weird game. I'm not sure I click with that yet, but I'm working on it. But I don't understand. What kind of coping are you doing with Darkest Dungeon? Being a bad player?
So, again, preliminary, I'm still in the early stages of it, but the general gist I'm getting is that the players who play Darkest Dungeon to cope will just hit their head and will just like adversity, like they're so stubborn. They're like, I am going to fight through this. And that was very funny when I first read that. I was in the interview and I was like, tell me more about that. Just like writing notes down, going, interesting. But also this idea of and this is kind of the meaning that I'm kind of deriving from the Darkest Dungeon, is this idea of like, it's never enough. It's never enough. You can never figure out everything. You can't plan it all. So what can you actually control? And what can you actually plan? And how can we make it work with what we've got? And this idea of, the designers have spoken at it like simulating the stress response. So people spoke about that a little bit. Again, I'm still in the early stages of analysis, but I feel like with Darkest Dungeon, it's about this idea. I could have done Dark Souls.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm like, Dark Souls feels like it would have been or like any Souls-like game.
Yeah.
Because like,
it's interesting. Like Darkest Dungeon is getting some interesting results, though. I feel like there's an element of this idea of like, it's purposely difficult. So how do you navigate that? It's the same with Dark Souls games. But I might use more games in the future, but I chose those 3 because I've played them. I've also played them before. So
that also helps. You need to know your subject, right?
Yeah, exactly. And but it was very funny when I was in one of my interviews, and I'm just sitting down and they're like telling me about Darkest Dungeon. They said, yeah, Darkest Dungeon basically is trying to like make me feel like I'm being stubborn and I will do this no matter what. And I'm like, come again? I just said like in the middle of the interview, I'm writing notes. I'm like, but it's honestly the stuff I'm finding out, because I'm doing this may only be relevant to like a few of your listeners, but I'm doing grounded theory, which is one of the most in-depth like qualitative methods, and it's all like grounded in the data, and I have to be very immersed into it. And I've got all the books. Obviously people at home can't find it, but I've got the books sitting at my desk.
Okay, but yeah, you're working though. Okay, so let's zoom forward a bit here. What kind of conclusions are you getting from this?
I think the main thing I'm starting to see is that there are definitely certain aspects of games that seem to support coping, and I feel like video games do support coping. What we are starting to find out is is there differences in terms of different types? That is still, we're working through that. And then the final piece of the puzzle will be, does it change over time? Can we see players' gaming habits and experiences of using video games to cope change over time? Because I've had so many anecdotal accounts tell me when my nan died or something, I played this game, played it while the whole experience happened, and I never touched it again. Yeah. And so I'm there like, okay, that's super interesting. Like, let's look at that and see what is it about when you played this versus at the end, and what changed. Like,
I think because there's an interesting aspect there, which is because very early on you were like, games are different from books or music or whatever in terms of coping, and I'm not necessarily sure that they are, because there are definitely times when like I've used, like during somebody's death, like I've listened to this album over and over again to help me just process my grief, or reading through these chapters of where characters are doing things so I can process my grief, or like, but that sort of thing happens a lot where it's like in this era and age and section of my life where I'm dealing with these kinds of problems, I am playing this game to help me process this external issue. And then when I've done it, I'm like, I can't go back to it because I've got so much emotion tied to that section of my life. Right?
And that's sort of where I'm at with like my own experience of Animal Crossing, is that for me, I feel like video games are such an amazing medium to help people process their emotion. And the research is basically trying to support some of that from a coping perspective, and also try to see, rather than just why video games help people cope, and look at like the how. Like, what is the actual components of games themselves that we can sort to see that, what are the, what is the actual aspects? Are there certain mechanics that we can potentially, from a, look at it from therapeutic aspects, or like we can kind of, as you're talking about your son earlier, of like, using this in a way that is like, games can help with learning or help game with understanding stuff. And for me, that's basically supporting all that. I realized fairly early on, I want to say sort of like end of year 1, start year 2, that I am not a Lego set. My research is not the Lego set. I am a tiny Lego brick in the wider Lego set. If I can move the research one tiny bit forward, I've done my job. So
speaking of things people use to cope.
I mean, true, exactly. But yeah, I feel like coping for me was a good way of helping try to contextualize some of these things. I didn't want to necessarily go too much into the life experiences themselves, purely for the fact that from a recalling accounts, that's very emotionally taxing on me as a researcher, like hearing multiple accounts of like death and mental health challenges, and you're just there like, I remember when I first started and I was like getting interviews, and I was there like, I need to just not talk to anybody. Whereas
so
now,
while my family is asphyxiated alone during COVID time, I used Animal Crossing to make myself feel better and pretend I had a real family still.
I mean, that's sort of, God. Yeah, like, I mean, that was sort of, I feel like a few people's experiences, but like, I honestly think that for me, that this research is a way to help understand some of the player experiences around games and well-being, but also seeing that players in a particular context of time, there are differences. It's not just players equal well-being. It's like, well, no, in this period of time, there is something special or something different about what people are going through. And what is it about video games that can help process, as a medium, process these emotions? Because it's an interactive experience. What is it that's the same? And that's sort of where I, the kind of higher level kind of epistemological position of my kind of a researcher is, I construct these people construct their worlds, and I want to understand what it is about it.
One of the things that gaming gives you that other mediums don't is agency.
Exactly.
It is the art of having, you are fully in control of what's going on here. Or even if you're even if you're playing a Dark Souls game or something else where you are not in control and you are just like barely struggling to survive and, fingernails hang on, there is a value in that, because it is like, I've seen people playing Souls-like games and stuff, because even though there's a struggle and it's very, very difficult and you're just getting beaten by forces you can't control, being able to overcome that and challenge that shows you that you're in your real life also able to possibly overcome these things that you can't necessarily control, right? And
yes, Shivam, you understand.
Look, dude, yes. I may not be a researcher, but I definitely deal with people as a
you understand, my friend.
Scholar here. And there's like, the thing is, like, when you're playing games where you've got control over something, obviously the answer is like, look, your real life is out of your control, but guess what? In Civilization, you can definitely flood that city if you want to, right? Like,
exactly. That's basically where I'm trying to develop this whole research on it. And again, I will, like, by this point it will be out in the world, published, and I can share. People ask me questions about it and all that kind of stuff. But
it'll be awesome.
But after that, I can then go be a Magic player. And
I was just gonna say, I'm like, there's something to be said about agency and decks and people playing Magic who are like, you've got this chaos and you don't know what's at the top, but I can control it. I'm like, yeah, but I don't want to be in control. I play Commander because I want to be 100%
Magic is such an interesting thing from that side. And it's so interesting when I see Magic players, when there's research about Magic, I'm like, oh, very interesting. But the other thing I want to also talk about, Shivam, is a few weeks ago, at time of recording, there was an announcement that Eternal Weekend is back. I'm very excited.
God, I want to go to Eternal Weekend so badly.
I'm going. I'm going to both America and I'm going to Prague. As soon as I found out, a friend of mine who wanted to go to the States, it sort of was like, hey, I'll go. And I was like, saying it and then going is two different things.
My problem is that Eternal Weekend in America is literally my wedding anniversary weekend.
Oh,
that is not a fight I'm going to win.
No, that is not a fight you're going to win.
No, and
that is definitely not. Definitely not. No. That is. But yeah, I'm going mostly as a sort of, because I'm aware that like with the PhD, like next year is going to be a lot more intense. This was my chance to
your last hurrah, your coping mechanism.
Basically, yeah. But I've since Eternal Weekend came back, I've always wanted to go to the States. Again, there's a bunch of people that I have interacted with daily that I have not seen in real life, and I am stoked to see people in real life. I mean, I think notable people here that we know are like Ryan Nicholas, like Tron is Bad. Like,
oh yeah,
I can't wait. Like the Eternal Durdles crew. I've met Brian Koval in Prague last year.
I love him. Bosch is
He's
lovely.
So great. I love Bosch.
First off, you go ahead.
No, I was going to say when we do our legacy videos, whenever someone goes Island Ponder, my immediate response: the spirit of Bosch and Roll lives on. It's the spirit of Bosch.
It's so funny because he's such a gentle dude, and he's so pleasant, and he's also like deeply, deeply educated. Like you know, he used to work with like mentally,
I did
people with deep challenges in life, and I'm like
him. Yeah, him and
the most level-headed thing ever. Right?
Like him and Andreas, I think, worked in like development, like child, like people with like difficulties and stuff. And I was like, oh my god!
And then he will just shank you in a game of CDH or Vintage or Legacy or whatever.
Yeah, I remember when we were like in sort of Prague, and we were like just testing. We were testing Vintage, and just like I was playing Mono White, he was playing Oath, and he was just like, play Oath. I'm like, okay, like March of Otherworld Delighted, Force. I'm like, okay, so you have a protected Oath, and now I die because this Attractor's going to hit, and then I'm dead. And he was like, yeah, this game's really easy. I'm like, oh, God's sakes, Bosch, shush. I was like, shush, Bosch. But yeah, so there's going to be a bunch of people, and there's like, again, like Jarvis Yu, and like, no, Anurag's not going because he's got a baby. But a bunch of people, but I will say this between yourself and myself, I am going to scare some Americans. I'm going to scare some Americans. I'm going to scare some Americans. I'm going to scare some Midwest Americans, and there's nothing they can do about it. Because I know myself. And
You are definitely like a comet that just kind of shows up and just explodes in them. It's like, whoop-ha!
Whatcha! Like, it's going to be great. I'm going to scare them.
Like, if you and Tappy Toeclaw are in the same room at the same time, I wonder about the kinetic energy going on there. Like, we can harness that and power a building.
Exactly. I was just like, harness that energy. But yeah, I say scare, and I jest about this, but like, there are going to be very mild-mannered Americans who are going to be like, what? But I'm also aware that there is going to be a lot of loud Americans that are also like ready to get on board this like hype train that is the Sahar Mirhadi experience, and we're going to have a great time.
What do you know what you're going to play yet?
Well, so at also time of recording, we recently had a ban announcement, and Grief got banned.
God, truly nobody was sad.
Nobody was sad.
Except for like the person who's like sitting there on a stockpile of 85 Griefs or whatever. Like, sorry, buddy.
No, those are gone. And then Urza Saga and Vexing Bauble got restricted in Vintage, and which I was also very surprised
Vexing Bauble is like, when I saw that card come out, I'm like, wow, somebody just got goozled in Vintage and was just really angry about it.
Exactly. I remember like a bunch of the Countervine players I know go, my deck don't work no more. I was like, I'm sorry, your deck don't work no more. But yeah, I that whole happened, and so I've kind of, the last sort of 24, 48 hours of just kind of like trying to figure out what I want to play. And I think after much maligning, I think I might be playing a blue deck. And I don't think I've touched a blue deck in like, I know, Habibi. I know. I'm sad that my ancient tools are probably going to have to stay at home.
Oh, God, man. Watching you with a force in hand doesn't feel right.
I was a devil player first, but yeah. I love Canadian Fresh. But I haven't. I feel like it will be. I've said this to co-host Sarah. I feel that an ancient tomb strategy outside of Eldrazi in Legacy is one that, like, obviously
it's not gonna win.
Eldrazi. Also, the problem is I could just build Eldrazi, but I looked up like how much it is to like get Eldrazi, and it's not even like I was like I have some of the like I have like the sort of the
Sure.
prison bits. That's the easy part. Do you know how much Ivugan is now?
Yes, I do, because I was trying to build friggin' as somebody who was also trying to build Eldrazi, it turns out when you put out like the Modern Horizon 3 with a friggin' Eldrazi deck in it or whatever, suddenly every kid in the planet wants to play Eldrazi, and that means they need to get Eye of Ugin, and that means that card now costs a $1 trillion.
Exactly.
It was like bulk for minute. Like after Eldrazi Winter and they banned, like it was like bulk.
I should have just
and
bought
now
them
it's just stupid.
Yeah, it is very silly. So yeah, Eye of Ugin's expensive, and then just this miscellaneous Eldrazi are expensive. It's like, like Kozilek's Command is like weirdly expensive and like stuff like that. So I decided, like, by the time I looked it up on Card Market, it was like something silly, like there was like going to be like £400-500 to like upgrade everything, and I was like, no, thank you, absolutely not.
Yeah, but Eldrazi is also hella fun to play.
I love it. Look, everyone is welcome in the Ancient Tomb Members Club. We will even take those combo players into our family, okay? We all are welcome in the Ancient Tomb Members Club. But it is something that I sort of realized that unless I could find someone to, like, just give me Eldrazi that they already have, for me, it's just, I just, also, the other thing, and I think this is something that's important from, like, me doing my research, but also just, like, thinking about Magic in general, is I think it's a good challenged for me, like as a sort of aspiring competitive player. Like I don't really get, sometimes you kind of get stuck into like your bubble of like, these are the decks I play, these are the decks for sure. This is my happy place. And don't get me wrong, Turn 1 Blood Moon is still a happy place. I love it. Do you know Broadside Bombardiers? Oh, love that card.
That card is dumb.
I love
Broadside Bombardier is the stupidest card. I love it in Cube so much.
Vanguard, very tasty. Very tasty. Very tasty. I love it. You ever thrown a One Ring with a Bombardiers? Oh my God. That stuff. That's better than chocolate sometimes. Obviously, you've drawn like 10 cards with One Ring, throw it, and then you're like, take 6. You're dead. But yeah, so outside of that, I felt like it was a good deck building challenge for me, and an opportunity for me to really have a I feel like you get better by playing different things and diversifying your play style and trying to get it. And I think the sort of Delver Tempos decks do naturally come to me in terms of the way I typically play. But I think that the lessons I've learned from playing these kind of aggro prison decks for, I want to say, nearly close to 3 years now, the heuristics I've learned from that are going to be so different to the blue heuristics. But that's also a good thing, because I'm not going to look at a hand of Island Ponder and be like, yeah, I'll keep this. I'm like, no, Happy P. I'm going to look at my Island Ponder and be like, yeah, I need a threat like now. Look at that. This hand does nothing. Give me a 6.
Yeah, that is one of the big problems I've learned, is that in this modern age of Eternal, you do not have the time you used to have to be able to sit and kind of build your presence. No, it's like, if you're not jamming now, you are over.
Yeah, you're dead. Not just 100%. Tameo is going to kill you. Frog going to kill you. So for me, it's going to be a nice deck building.
Frog, man. What the hell?
It's not okay. That is another reason why I'm not playing Ancient Tomb, because as a Moon Stompy nerd and Ancient Tomb fangirl, I look at Psychic Frog. I remember the first time I saw it spot. I'm like, I can't Fury that card. I can dead gon it. That's a Band-Aid. And I was looking at all the red removal that I had available. I was like, I got to Pyroblast it. With my Chalice of the Void deck, I got to I was like, absolutely not. Get this card out of my sight. But I also think that, that again, by the way, but I feel like I'm going to play a blue deck. I'm probably going to play some form of Tepo deck. By the time of recording, I'll be knee deep in like learning how to like acclimatize it. The good thing is as well is I have access to people who I trust, who are very good Eternal Magic wizards. And they're very good at the wizard squares, and I feel like I can learn from them and like understand some of the heuristics that are slightly different in playing blue, and I think that is honestly a net positive. In Vintage, however, I will be sticking to playing the Strong Ladies of Initiative, because you can prize those. You can prize White Plume Adventurer and Seasoned Dungeoneer on my cold dead hands.
I love those cards so much.
I do too. I love it.
I don't know if Initiative is the best thing in the world in one-on-one, but I love those cards anyways.
I love them. In Commander, it's fine.
Oh, yeah.
In one-on-one, it is not okay.
No, it's not.
But in Vintage, it's fine, because in Vintage, people are doing broken stuff anyway. So,
well, yeah, I mean, like, look, dude, that guy like pooing your initiative sitting there with Trinisphere out, right? So it's like, let's chill, buddy. You don't get any room to talk here.
You go oath into Atraxa, or like tinker into Bolus's Citadel, or Vault Key. Honestly, my main groan thing with Vintage, apart from upkeep Ancestral, I'm like, congratulations, you opened a restricted card. Or when they demonic tutor for Ancestral, and you're like, congratulations, you figured
I like
it
when
out.
they demonic tutor for Island personally. Then I'm like, okay. Now I know where you're going.
But then my favorite one is when Urza Saga was like a thing. You get rid of the first one, then they play a second one, and you're like, I just dealt with this. I just wastelanded that one.
We just had this conversation.
And then they go like Vault Key, and you're like, oh, I kind of do this, the Shia LaBeouf clap of like, congratulations, you did the thing.
Ooh, look at you.
Exactly. Did little baby figure out how to play Vault Key together? Isn't it beautiful? Oh. But it's fine. I accept that is the rules of engagement when I play Vintage.
I mean, look, you're playing Vintage. Your Vault Key exists. That's the
point of Vault Key.
It's the price of admission, right? Like,
exactly, and I love it. And I think that with Vintage, it's one of those formats, both Legacy and Vintage. I feel like they get the shtick of like, oh, this is like how it's meant to be played. And honestly, for Vintage and to a certain extent Legacy, Vintage gets like everything happens on turn one. I'm like, sometimes that happens. But I have been in so many games where it's like turn 41, and you're there like,
turns out you used all your gas on turn one, and now you got nothing.
You're sitting there like Bug versus like Loris Saga, and you're both. Okay. You just sit there like exchanging resources. Before you know it, you're all basically just top decking, and you're like, yeah. What's this? Oh, that will do.
It's just like miserable, like slog, right?
Oh, I love it. It's so hilarious when you see like Tinker play. It's like OG like Esper Tinker players, and then they're playing against like Bug, which is like the fairest deck in Vintage, and they're both just like slogging it out like lands and spells, and it just turns into
when
limited.
You're playing a Tinker deck at fair speed, you have failed.
I mean, yes, but also
have happened to you?
Have you seen Monastery Mentor? That card, absolutely. Like that card makes me so happy.
You know what? You're gonna hate me, but the deck I really want to get in Legacy and Vintage, I want to play lands really badly. I love lands. It's so much fun. But like, turns out I don't want to sell my house to get a place at a Tabernacles.
You only need one. You only really need one tabby. But like, even still, actually, I have a very fun story before we close. So, a friend of mine, I shan't name him, but because he'll just get annoyed at me. But I had a friend who was looking to borrow cards for Eternal Weekend for Vintage, and one of our friends was like, "Yeah, I can lend it to you, but it's like beta power," and they're like, "Excuse me, what?" What did you say to me? And he was like, but he's also a collector, and he had found these old like Japanese like Mario Pikachus like from like a friend, and was like, I will give you my tabernacle for these Pikachus, because he thought that these Pikachus were like a lot of money, and they were like, yeah, we'll do this exchange. And then he got them graded. I think Beckett graded them, and then he sold them and made a nice pretty penny, and then he bought 4 Bazaar of Baghdad. And so to avoid borrowing Beta Power, he now has 4 Sahara Baghdad. And I am like, that is an ultimate flex move. Subsequently, he has then bought the Tabernacle again. But I was like, you're such a baller. You, to avoid borrowing the cost of what is effectively a house, you went through this 6
the entire lengthy rigmarole.
And now he's a bizarre gamer. Now he's bizarre gamer till he dies because he has those cards. Yeah, and now he's like.
I ran into somebody on Arena yesterday playing effectively Dredge. They had Narcomoebas and they had Creeping Chills and everything. They were just millions. I'm like, how are you playing Dredge in Standard or like in Explorer or whatever? There's no bazaars, there's no nothing. And I'm like, you know what, man? My heart goes out to you, dude. You have found a way to play Dredge in a format that has literal zero Dredge.
I love
and
Dredge.
I'm like, you know what? Dredge is gonna dredge, right? Like,
Dredge is gonna dredge. Well, my husband at Magicon traded a bunch of cards. He bought some LEDs like years ago, but he's kept one because he has Canadian Highlander Dredge. And for the longest time, he used to have his LED in Muldrotha because you could play it again and then discard your hand of Muldrotha and then play more stuff.
I hate that entire chain of words that just came out of your mouth.
I love it. He actually, so I think the highlight of his Commander life. So my husband Dan, we actually make Commander content. I will do the links, but yeah, we do main event Magic. My Too Sweet MTG. He's very, very good at making Commander and Cube content. I'm going to do the plug because I promised him I'll do the plug.
Yes,
but I remember playing Commander with him, and he living deafed. He living deafed. And then he had no cards in library. And then a Muldrifter came and he lost the game. And he was like, you know what? I'm out. That's the greatest thing that's ever happened.
If you deck yourself with your own Living Death to Muldrifter, that is a win in my heart.
Exactly. I've never seen him as happy playing Commander in my life.
Okay. So before you go, though, I want to share something because I know you as an Eternal player will enjoy this. A friend of mine found a box of a Mirage starter deck in his house that he'd been sitting on for 1,000 million years. And I was just like, I will just buy it from you sight unseen. I don't care. And in it, there was a Shallow Grave.
Oh, I love Shallow Grave. There's a Shallow Grave downstairs in my house.
A Phyrexian Dreadnought.
Oh, hello, Shrimpy.
And a Curse Totem. And I was like, look at this. This is classic vintage gaming right there. That is
I love it.
Magic old-fashioned style. Man, Shallow Grave is such a good card.
Shallow Grave is such a good card. I had a very small quick story before we go. I had the same thing. A friend of mine, one of my researcher friends, brought me a box of cards he had from like Stronghold to Exodus, sort of late 90s, 2002 time. He had the starter like deck in like the old Ultra Pro sleeve. Entire Rebels deck hasn't seen the sunlight in 20 years. But inside that deck were 4 Gaius Kratos. Just hanging out. There was an all rod. There was like a bunch of like weird Eternal cards. I was like, first you get these cards like sold, Habibi, because these cards are expensive. And he was like, oh, I'm planning to go to Japan. I'm like, well, that's all pay you to go to Japan, my friend. And then there was a bunch of like miscellaneous cards. I was like, can I just buy these off you? Like it was like, Ophir Druids and a bunch of like, vintage and legacy staples, like Lotus Petals. He's like, so yeah, you can have them. Like, there you go, 50 quid, take the lot. I was like, bargain. Thank you.
Here, happy birthday, right?
I took like
right 15 now.
Take 15 cards and went home. But yeah, I love those stories of just seeing stuff in the wild that is like,
oh yeah, it makes me happy.
I'm so glad it's the tales are still true.
Yeah, it's nice to be able to find these gems in the olden days.
Oh yeah,
but with that though, I'm going to call this one a day.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining me. It's always fun to talk to you. God, I love talking to you, Sahir. So if people want to find you and all the plugs now, you can do your plugs. Go ahead.
I can do more plugs. So Sahar Mirhadi on the internet. I have a YouTube channel called The Legacy Gambit where myself and my co-host Sarah Grenham make educational and fun Eternal format content every single week. So we are going through the A to Z of Legacy and playing new decks as they come out, talking about Legacy and Vintage as they pan out, but also formats like Dual Commander and
Dual Commander is awesome.
Dual Commander is awesome. And Modern, because Sarah also is a Modern gamer. And then my husband, I'm going to plug him, Too Sweet MTG. He makes Commander and Cube content. So he has Too Sweet MTG for Commander and Cube, and then Powerful Nothing is his podcast. So
Awesome.
all the plugs. Main Event Magic. Go follow us. It's amazing.
Thank you again for joining me. I love this. I love talking to you. It's always a blast.
Yay.
And I hope we get to run into each other again sometime once your PhD is done, or whatever the next European show is, I guess.
Exactly. I cannot wait.
But with that, my friends, you can see me at Gear Report Gears. You can find this podcast anywhere podcasts are sold, or at YouTube every Tuesday. Thanks to my editor, Dan. You can also hear me on Shivam and Wheeler Love Magic, where me and Ben Wheeler sit and talk about every set in Magic ad nauseum for literal hours.
I love it.
And you can also hear me on the Chronicles of Dragonlance, where me and my friend John sit and talk about Dragonlance novels, because I like the sound of my own voice. And remember, all this is possible because you guys support me at patreon.com/ShivanB. But remember, my friends, it's not magic without the gathering, and we'll see you next time.